What if I told you the Black Death was merely a symptom, not the core problem? Stop for just 3 seconds and imagine the air itself as an enemy, heavy and thick, carrying the inevitable sentence of death on every passing gust. Because when you look back at the Middle Ages, your memory is likely dominated by the stark, terrifying shadow of the Black Death. This single catastrophic event, which purged a significant portion of the continent, has been enshrined as the ultimate symbol of medieval fragility. Yet to focus solely on the bubonic plague is to miss the relentless, grinding reality of everyday existence. The dramatic, rapid collapse of the plague was only the climax of a much longer, quieter conflict, forcing us to look beyond the spectacular devastation to understand the constant endemic pressures that truly shortened lives and molded society. Because you stand now at the precipice of a world perpetually besieged, where the unseen invaders held ultimate dominion. Why did the average medieval person die so young? Forget the Black Death. It was a dramatic symptom, not the silent, ceaseless illness that truly defined medieval existence. The waves of sickness began long before the infamous plague of 1346. From the 6th century onward, diseases like smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis maintained a constant circulating threat, far more insidious than any single acute outbreak. These illnesses did not vanish between epidemics. They simply retreated into the backdrop of daily life, weakening immune systems and ensuring that only the most robust survived childhood. This wasn't merely a backdrop of ill health. It was the essential, inescapable fact of medieval demographics. So, to survive past the age of 10 was to navigate a biological lottery, the odds perpetually stacked against you. How did medieval streets become biological time bombs? Stop and picture the suffocating darkness. The medieval city was a biological nightmare. Consider the world through which you walked in the medieval city, the narrow, unlit alleys, barely 6 feet wide, where sunlight struggled to penetrate the gloom. Houses were stacked haphazardly, cold, dark, and eternally damp, fostering conditions ripe for microbial life. There was no scientific understanding of germs. The air itself was believed to carry illness, and miasma hung heavy over the muddy thoroughfares. The smells of sweat, manure, and rotting refuse were so omnipresent as to become virtually unnoticed, forming a toxic environmental layer across settlements. The greatest killer of the Middle Ages was not an invading army, but an invisible siege waged against the very young. And this lack of hygienic awareness was compounded by the structure of domestic life. Peasants, and often city dwellers, slept on beds of straw that crawled perpetually with vermin, fleas, lice, and mice that served as vectors for countless pathogens. Several individuals often shared the same rough bedding, ensuring maximum transmission during the night. In the cities, open sewage and the casual discarding of waste meant flies buzzed ceaselessly, transporting invisible dangers from the latrines directly to the meager food supply, meaning the very ground you trod was saturated with the bacteria that would ultimately condemn you. What did medieval people secretly fear most about sickness? Think about the agonizing reality of relying only on luck and prayer. The cycle of disease was intimately tied to the cycle of the seasons and the land. Winter brought severe dietary restrictions, stripping away the availability of fresh produce and essential vitamins, and failed harvests meant outright famine. This chronic malnutrition left the young, the elderly, and the poor critically vulnerable. Continuous exposure to parasites, alongside a diet lacking basic nutrients, rendered the body a weak fortress against contagion. Medieval people knew sickness could spread person to person, but the how remained a terrifying mystery, leaving them reliant on luck and prayer. Did medieval medicine make suffering worse? Among the visible afflictions, few inspired as much existential dread as leprosy. Caused by a slow-moving bacterium, it attacked the nerve endings, leading to agonizing pain and extreme disfigurement. Though not highly contagious, society's response was absolute and brutal. You were not simply ill, you were ritually excommunicated. There was no cure, only a slow, miserable decline. The psychological burden of this isolation often surpassed the physical suffering of the disease itself. The bold claim is that medieval physicians knew that contagion spread, yet their attempts to banish the sickness only served to condemn the suffering further, as demonstrated by the terrifying account of Alice the leper, recorded by a monk in 1250. He wrote of her shrunken hands, her skin fissured like the bark of a dry tree, and her legs resembling a flayed calf, swollen, oozing pus, every part of her body visibly deteriorating. The fear of infection prompted the earliest attempts at public health isolation. If you contracted this illness, you were exiled, often forced to carry a bell or rattle. Imagine the sound, a continuous, mournful tolling that announced your approach, warning all healthy citizens to shun your presence, a sound that underscored your complete social downfall. What if I told you medieval knights died more from worms than from swords? Even those deemed powerful were not immune to the invisible siege. Excavations at the French castle of Saran-de-Colonne in Cyprus, a crusader stronghold, offered a morbid glimpse into the internal struggles of fighting men. Analysis of the castle's latrines revealed that a significant percentage of the stationed knights perished not from combat, but from malnutrition and infectious diseases. The eggs of roundworm and whipworm parasites were found in the soil sediment, a testament to shockingly poor hygiene. How did bad toilets kill medieval soldiers? These intestinal parasites were the silent eaters, transmitted orally through contaminated water and fecal matter due to systemic sanitation failures. Worms fed directly on the nutrients digested by the host, leading the knights to suffer crippling malnourishment, even when rations were adequate. This continuous internal drain, combined with the stress of military life, rendered them acutely susceptible to other contagions. What came next changed everything for the sick. As leprosy cases declined in the 13th century, a more efficient killer began its swift, silent hunt. Why did tuberculosis replace leprosy as the medieval plague? Tuberculosis, or consumption, replaced leprosy as a major epidemic threat. While it lacked the visible external horror of the leper, its efficiency as a killer was unmatched. The bacteria typically targeted the lungs, destroying tissue and leading to a drawn-out terminal illness that appeared to consume the victim from the inside. This was a disease that permeated the increasingly crowded cities, utilizing the damp, shared air as its primary weapon. Wait, why was a horrifying disease called the King's Evil? Sometimes the TB bacteria manifested in the lymph nodes of the neck, creating large swellings known as scrofula. This affliction acquired a strange, paradoxical designation, the King's Evil. The belief took root that the monarch, by divine right, possessed the miraculous power to cure this specific illness simply through a touch. Beginning in 11th century France and adopted by English kings like Henry I, the ritual of the touchings offered a flicker of hope. Following the public ceremony, the affected person was presented with a small, gold-plated coin, an angel, to be worn as a protective charm, fusing spiritual authority with medical despair. What made medieval cities death traps? In the densely populated medieval cities, disease became a relentless, lethal cocktail. Epidemic typhus spread rapidly, borne by body lice and fleas, causing high fevers, delirium, coma, and inevitable death. Meanwhile, the fundamental sanitation failure led to dysentery and typhoid fever. The bacteria spread through food and water contaminated by human waste, caused chronic diarrhea and rapid, dangerous dehydration. Untreated typhoid fever was a systematic 3-week process of exhaustion and emaciation. Before you read of the distant past, know this. The fear of contamination was a daily ritual, shaping every handshake, every market visit, every breath you took. Measles and smallpox, often confused in contemporary records, tore through populations whose immune systems were already severely compromised by malnutrition and constant parasitic exposure. Various influenza-type viruses swept through communities with terrifying speed, dramatically shortening life expectancy, particularly among the very young and the very old. Only a small fraction of medieval people, perhaps 9, ever reached the relatively grand age of 60. But this wasn't the end. A greater storm was gathering just outside the European borders. How did scientists rewrite the history of medieval death when the Black Death finally arrived in 1346? It arrived to a population already biologically worn down and psychologically broken by centuries of endemic disease. It was the great dramatic climax, but recent scientific analysis compels us to revise the entire hierarchy of medieval killers. Biological anthropologists, utilizing modern techniques like X-rays and CT scans on skeletal remains, have exposed previously invisible threats, adding cancer to the major classes of diseases that afflicted medieval peoples. The discovery that changes everything. Medieval cancer was far more common than history recorded. Prior studies, relying only on exterior bone lesions, had suggested cancer was a rarity. However, research conducted on 143 adult skeletons from medieval cemeteries, including those who died in hospitals, revealed a hidden truth. Focusing on the pelvis, femora, and spinal columns, areas most likely to show evidence of metastases, scientists predicted that somewhere between 9 and 14 of medieval Britons developed cancer. The vast majority of these cancers would have occurred in soft tissue, long since disease. They composed, suggesting the actual prevalence was far higher than previously thought. Why medieval biology guaranteed ill health? For centuries, historians believed that infectious diseases and malnutrition were the sole significant causes of medieval ill health. We now have to add cancer to this grim ledger, a condition often triggered in the Middle Ages by unchecked bacteria, viruses, and parasites, the very pathogens that compromised the populace in so many other ways. While modern cancer rates are significantly higher due to increased longevity, environmental factors, and tobacco, the medieval body was battling a genetically predisposed vulnerability alongside a sea of internal invaders. Stop obsessing over the Black Death. What was the real #1 killer? The final crucial understanding shifts the focus entirely away from the dramatic sudden collapse of the plague. Researchers studying medieval morbidity have agreed that the single greatest health problem of the Middle Ages was not the Black Death, but the cumulative forces of infant and child mortality. You must confront the profound reality that your risk of dying from an endemic childhood disease was perhaps 20 times higher than your risk of succumbing to the infamous plague, the unseen killer that defines the Middle Ages. The plague is visible, dramatic, and famous. It is the tip of the iceberg, the spectacular event that draws the eye. But 4 to 8 times more people died from the half-dozen chronic bacterial and viral infections that formed the constant sea of pathogens. This invisible force was as omnipresent and powerful as gravity, continually assailing the population, especially when immunity was compromised by hunger or poverty. The true history of the Middle Ages is a history of biological warfare. These chronic infectious diseases decided the fate of military campaigns, molded settlement patterns, and ensured that grief was an inescapable, perpetual companion in every home. Medieval people lived under a biological dictatorship. The life they lived was a short, intense struggle against a world that was actively trying to consume them from the outside in. The true history of the Middle Ages is the history of resilience in the face of this ceaseless internal war. How did surviving sickness actually make you weaker? The cumulative effect of this constant assault meant that life was a precarious thread, often snapped long before old age. Even if an individual survived the immediate threat of smallpox or the internal drain of parasites, their immune system carried the scars. Every cough, every fever, every infected cut represented a potentially fatal setback. This pervasive fragility made large-scale endeavors from construction to warfare exponentially more difficult and costly in human terms. Why medieval cures were often death sentences. Medieval medicine, rooted in the ancient theory of the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was fundamentally ill-equipped to handle microbial invaders. Physicians sought balance through purging, bleeding, and herbal remedies based on superstition rather than biology. Their cures were often long ways off, and their efforts, while well-intentioned, frequently did more harm than good, accelerating the patient's severe suffering. When did fear become the only effective medicine? This scientific vacuum led to the intense social reliance on rituals and superstition for protection. You might wear an amulet, attend Mass fervently, or partake in frantic processions, hoping to appease an angry, invisible entity believed to be causing the sickness. The fear transformed into a societal ritual, where avoidance and isolation became the only truly effective, if brutal, forms of containment they possessed. The terrible cost of reaching old age in the medieval world. Those who did survive into their later years, those few percent who bypassed the infant deaths, the consumption, and the ravages of fever, carried the heavy cost of that survival. Chronic pain, lingering infections, and damaged organs were the inevitable residue of a life lived in a sea of pathogens. Survival was a testament not only to biological fortitude, but often to economic privilege, which allowed for slightly better sanitation and nutrition. The silence that echoes through medieval history. The medieval era forces us to confront the true meaning of downfall, not just the spectacular collapse of empires, but the slow, daily downfall of human potential curtailed by biological forces. Millions of brilliant minds, innovative spirits, and potential leaders were lost before they could contribute, their lives extinguished by microscopic enemies. Their silence is the loudest testimony to the reality of medieval mortality. How did death shape medieval government and religion? The constant presence of death fundamentally shaped political and spiritual power. If life was short and brutal, the promise of eternal salvation or the authority of the anointed king held immense, immediate appeal. The ephemeral nature of human existence lent an urgent intensity to religious belief and reinforced the often arbitrary power structures that promised some form of stability or protection. To live in the Middle Ages was to maintain a continuous, intimate relationship with mortality. Death was not a distant event, but a near certainty, a familiar neighbor. This acceptance, or perhaps resignation, colored every aspect of art, law, and philosophy. It required an immense psychological endurance to live, knowing that any day could be the last, perhaps taken by an illness that left you consumed or disfigured. The hidden lesson the medieval world teaches us about today. While we have eradicated many of the medieval endemic diseases, the lessons remain stark. We often overlook the subtle systemic vulnerabilities in favor of dramatic crises. The medieval experience reminds us that constant vigilance against the invisible, whether biological or social, is the true requirement for stability and progress. When you finally step back from this shadowed world, remember
the toll. Remember the ceaseless tolling of the leper's bell? The dry, cracked skin and the bodies slowly consumed by internal invaders. The Middle Ages was not just a time of castles and crusades. It was a testament to the brutal, continuous struggle against the fragility of the human body. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. The suffering described is used solely to illustrate the historical realities of medieval health crises. If this story made you reflect on the fragility of power and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of constant peril, you're welcome to continue the journey with us. Walk further into history's shadows with us as we seek to uncover the quiet, often overlooked truths of the past.